She didn't die on the stake. Not really. By the time the flames reached her, the worst was already over. Or perhaps the worst was the waiting. The broken bones. The silence she refused to break. The men in power who smiled while they destroyed her, piece by piece, in a cold stone room beneath London where no crowd could watch and no record would survive. Anne Askew was 25 years old, a woman in a world that didn't believe women could think, let alone resist. And yet, she became the only woman in English history known to have been tortured in the Tower of London. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The execution wasn't the punishment. The punishment was everything that came before it. England, 1546. A country cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. King Henry VIII, bloated, paranoid, and dying, sat on a throne held together by fear. The Protestant Reformation had torn through Europe like wildfire, and England was caught between two worlds. The old Catholic order and the dangerous new ideas spreading through smuggled books, whispered prayers, and secret meetings in back rooms. To believe the wrong thing, in the wrong year, in the wrong company, was to sign your own death warrant. Anne Askew was born into this world in 1521 in Lincolnshire, a sharp-minded girl in a household that valued obedience over intelligence. She came from a respectable family, educated enough to read, which in itself was unusual for a woman of her time. But reading was dangerous, because reading led to thinking, and thinking led Anne Askew somewhere her world never intended her to go. She became a Protestant, not quietly, not privately. And Anne read scripture openly, debated theology in public, and refused to accept the Church's interpretation of communion, a position that placed her directly in the crosshairs of the most powerful men in England. She was eventually forced into a marriage she hadn't chosen to a Catholic man who wanted a wife, not a thinker. He threw her out. She walked to London, alone, determined, unbroken. In London, she found a community of like-minded reformers, some of them dangerously close to the Queen's own court. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife, moved in circles where Protestant ideas quietly flourished, and Anne Askew moved in those same circles. That connection, that proximity to power, would become her undoing. Because someone was watching. The King's conservative advisers, men like Bishop Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, were desperate to bring down the Protestant influence surrounding the King. They believed Anne Askew was the key. Break her, and she would name names. Name names, and they could reach the Queen herself. She was arrested in 1546, taken to a room she would never truly leave. What happened next was not justice. It was a hunt. The first interrogation was almost civil. Almost. Anne was brought before the council and questioned about her beliefs, specifically whether she believed the bread and wine of communion physically became the body and blood of Christ. It was a theological trap, carefully constructed. Answer one way, and she was a heretic. Answer another, and she was a liar. Anne Askew did neither. She answered their questions with questions. She deflected with scripture. She was calm, composed, and, most infuriatingly to her interrogators, completely unafraid. The men across the table had broken confessions out of hardened criminals, and here was a 25-year-old woman who smiled through their threats like she already knew something they didn't. They released her. That was their first mistake. She wasn't silent after her release. She kept preaching, kept meeting with reformers, kept writing. And here is where history reveals something remarkable. Anne Askew documented her own interrogations in a text known as the Examinations, one of the earliest surviving autobiographical accounts written by an English woman. She wasn't just surviving, She was recording, she was building evidence, not against herself, but against them. When they arrested her the second time, the civility was gone. This time there was no council chamber, no careful questions. She was taken to a place that operated outside the normal rules of English law, the Tower of London. And inside the tower a machine waited for her, one that had rarely, if ever, been used on a woman. The rack, a wooden frame, 2 rollers at each end, ropes tied to the wrists and ankles, and then, slowly, mechanically, methodically, the rollers turned in opposite directions, stretching the body until joints separated, ligaments tore, and bones shifted out of place. But here is the detail that history glosses over. The men operating the rack that day were not ordinary guards. One of them was Sir Richard Rich, a Privy Councillor. The other was Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor of England, the highest legal officer in the entire country. They were operating the torture device themselves. Think about what that means. These weren't men who delegated. They came personally, rolled up their sleeves, and turned the handles. Because what they needed from Anne Askew wasn't just a confession. It was names. Specifically, the names of the Protestant women in Catherine Parr's court who had been passing banned books and funding reformers. Anne said nothing. They turned the handles further. She still said nothing. At some point, and this detail comes directly from her own account, the lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Anthony Knevet, became so disturbed by what he was witnessing that he left the room and rode directly to the king to report what was happening. He believed the torture had gone beyond legal limits. Even by the brutal standards of Tudor England, what was being done to Anne Askew was considered excessive. Henry VIII reportedly gave a vague, non-committal response. The torture continued. By the time they stopped, Anne Askew's body was destroyed. Her arms and legs had been so severely stretched that she could no longer stand. She could not walk. She could barely sit upright. Guards had to carry her back to her cell, where she sat on the cold stone floor, broken in body, but not in will, and still refused to give them a single name, not one. The men who had come to break her left the tower that day, having accomplished nothing, except confirming that they were dealing with someone whose resolve they had catastrophically underestimated. And now they had a problem, a very public one. July 16, 1546, Smithfield, London. The square was packed. Thousands had come, not because executions were rare, but because this one was different. Word had spread through the city's narrow streets and crowded taverns. People came to witness something they had never seen before and would never forget. 4 Protestant heretics were to be burned at the stake. One of them had to be carried to her own execution. Anne Askew arrived at Smithfield unable to walk. Her body, destroyed by the rack, could not support her weight. So they did something that reveals more about their cruelty than any court record ever could. They tied her to a chair, and they carried the chair to the stake, and they chained her to it, sitting upright, so the crowd could see her face. They wanted her to look defeated. She didn't. Eyewitness accounts describe Anne Askew at Smithfield as eerily composed, no weeping, no begging, no final collapse of the spirit they had spent months trying to break. She sat in that chair, in that square, surrounded by thousands of strangers, and she was, by every account, still. Not the stillness of resignation. The stillness of someone who had already decided long ago that this moment would not define her, that they would not have the satisfaction of her fear. A last-minute offer was made, a royal pardon, if she would simply recant, deny her beliefs, sign a piece of paper, walk away. She refused, and here is the detail that should stop you cold. Before the flames were lit, Gunpowder had been tied around the bodies of the condemned, a rare mercy intended to quicken death. But as the fire caught and the smoke rose over Smithfield, something went wrong. Or perhaps something went exactly as someone intended. The gunpowder ignited unevenly, the crowd lurched backward, and Anne Askew, already shattered, already chained, already beyond any further earthly harm, was engulfed. She made no sound that the crowd could hear. She was gone. But the men who had ordered her death had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had burned her body. They could not burn what she had written. They thought it was over. It wasn't. Within years of her death, Anne Askew's own written accounts, her examinations, were smuggled out of England, printed abroad by the Protestant reformer John Bale, and distributed across Europe. The very words she had scratched out in secret, documenting her interrogations with quiet precision, became one of the most widely read Protestant texts of the 16th century. The men who tortured her had wanted silence. Instead, they created a voice that outlasted every single one of them. Bishop Gardiner died in disgrace. Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor who personally turned the rack, was stripped of his office within months. Catherine Parr survived. The Protestant Reformation they had tried to crush continued its march across England and eventually reshaped the entire country. Anne Askew had given them nothing, and in giving them nothing, she gave history everything. But step back for a moment, because this story is not just about one woman in one century. It is about something far more enduring and far more uncomfortable. It is about what happens when power decides that a person's mind is a threat. When the establishment cannot tolerate someone who thinks differently, speaks freely, and refuses to be silenced, even under unimaginable pain. And this has never stopped happening. The tools change, the century changes, the language of justification changes, but the instinct to break the ones who refuse to conform, that remains disturbingly familiar. Anne Askew was 25 years old. She had no army, no title, no protection. She had only conviction, and in the end, conviction was the one thing they could never take from her. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how far they turned those handles, she didn't survive. But she won. So here is the question this story leaves behind, and it is worth sitting with. If they came for your voice, your beliefs, your right to think freely, what would you refuse to give up? Because Anne Askew answered that question in the most brutal way imaginable, and her answer still echoes.